Oh, away with you! Back to your sex, beggar!
On my shoulder.
Released in 1990 on the Nintendo Dream Jizz, Final Fantasy III made an irrefutable mark on the JRPG genre with its now iconic job system, allowing players to freely switch between numerous jobs of differing specialties. The ripples of Final Fantasy III are still being felt today. 34 years later, 2024, Metaphor ReFantazio is released for the... what? Sega Game Boy. The question's on everyone's minds. Is Metaphor too similar to Final Fantasy III? Does Metaphor truly stand on its own merits, or is it just a pale imitation of its predecessor? And of course, what the hell does ReFantazio mean? These answers, and many more to come. Metaphor is an interesting case. On one hand, a game that is wholly unique, a fully fleshed out fantasy world complete with its own extensive lore and interesting characters to populate it. On the other hand, it's the same game Atlus has been releasing for years now. Indeed, few are the games as ambitiously unambitious as Metaphor. A cursory glance at Metaphor may leave one with the impression that it is nigh indistinguishable from Final Fantasy III. But upon closer inspection, it's Metaphor's rich world of Uchronia that distinguishes it. Being a fantasy world, its inhabitants are not quite the same as our own. There are a total of 9 races, each with their own defining characteristics. This was something that caught my attention, not because they're all drastically different, as with most fantasy settings, but because they're so similar. Unless this was Atlus being especially lazy with their designs, I'd say it was intentional, as it ties well into the game's themes. Racial prejudice runs amok in Uchronia, and its people have no problem showing it. Any old NPC you run into is ready to deliver an impassioned racial diatribe at the drop of a hat. The fact that the only thing that visually separates the tribes could be something as trivial as having horns or not goes to show how stupid racism is. Except against the Ujif. Bug-eyed freaks. This isn't the only all-too-familiar issue Metaphor tackles. Despite it being fantasy, I feel this is the most realistic world Atlus has ever crafted. Almost as if it's some sort of Never mind. You wouldn't get it. Justice, the nature of religion, the nature of power, fear and uncertainty are all central themes. Minor spoilers. There's one line in particular that I think perfectly captures the essence of Metaphor's setting, spoken by the realest G to ever do it. People will always prefer their own feelings to the truth. Poignant. Through it all, Metaphor conveys a message of hope. How the only way to bring about true change is through kindness and understanding. How reality can change through the power of dreams. Or, said another way, through the power of fantasy. Final Fantasy. If that sounds contrived, well, it kind of is. but Metaphor presents it in such an endearingly earnest way that it's hard not to be fully on board. All this relayed through a main premise that is quite compelling. Regicide. The king is dead, the heir apparent cursed. The king's death sets forth a series of events that establishes a race to crown a successor. It's up to the boy from the Elder tribe to travel the land for a way to break the prince's curse, gain the support of the people, and hell, maybe even make some new friends along the way. There's a great deal of intrigue throughout in terms of learning more about the tribes, the beasts known as humans.
That's no ordinary monster. Some kind of human?
And the origins of Uchronia. And of course, the characters. Each party member has a complete and satisfying arc, even ones gained later in the game, which is no small feat considering how many there are. I feel these are some of the most nuanced, believable characters Atlus has ever crafted, despite the fantasy setting. Heisme may look like the Taco Bell Chihuahua, but behind that freakish countenance is profound grief, a man searching for purpose.
Yo quiero Taco Bell.
There's one more character that truly elevates Metaphor's narrative.
Your Eminence.
Louis Guillaburn. There's something about a blonde British bastard that just evokes primal hatred, and it's in full effect with Louis.
Your fool of a king is dead!
He's a perfect foil to the protagonist's hippy-dippy bullshit, instead believing that might makes right, that those who are fit to survive are those with the power to do so. But he's not without reason. He's the type of dude to be like, by all means, if you kill me, you're just proving my point and I deserve to die. But you don't have what it takes to kill me. And the worst part is, he's right. But what takes Louis from a good villain to a great villain is that he makes some pretty good points, given how oppressive Uchronia is.
A land grotesque as its people.
Is he cunning? Sure. Ruthless? Absolutely. But outright malicious? I'm not so sure. Louis's Darwinist philosophy juxtaposed against the protagonist's more compassionate philosophy makes for genuinely interesting considerations on the finer points of each. Is what I would say if this wasn't roughly the 1,000th time Atlus has written something like this. Though to be fair, I'd have no problem saying this is the best version of it, if not just for the sheer charisma that Louis brings to the table. I can't stress this enough. The narrative aspects are the reason to play Metaphor, and that's why I'll only mention surface level plot details. The gameplay of Metaphor is where it most wears its influences on its sleeve. Gameplay outside of battle is divided into days in which the player must manage their time doing activities. Overworld activities include talking to friends, traveling, raising stats, and farming. Sound familiar? Stardew Valley. Whereas Stardew Valley focuses more on the social sim aspect with sparse, simplified combat, Metaphor strikes a balance. I'd put it somewhere between Stardew Valley and Rune Factory, with Rune Factory being more combat focused and Stardew being more narrative focused. It feels pretty close to a perfect balance. There were definitely times playing through Stardew where I'd be on the third hour of a cutscene mashing through the dialogue and thinking, when the fuck do I get back to my farm? Likewise, there were definitely times playing through Rune Factory where upon killing my 100th nameless goblin, I desperately wished for something more to keep me invested. Preferably a sexy blonde guy. For what it's worth, I didn't feel strongly in either direction playing through Metaphor, and that's a good thing. It's a fact that there's less to do in Metaphor's overworld than there is in Stardew's. There's less characters to talk to and interactions are trimmed down. Consequently, this makes these conversations feel extremely efficient, and it's impressive how much they manage to get across with only 8 interactions per character. They're pulling triple duty. 1, obviously they have an arc for the character you're talking to in which they overcome some hardship and learn something. 2, they inform more about the tribes, their hardships and cultures. And 3, they inform more about the world at large, expanding on things like Uchronia's technology and its primary religion of sanctism. One marked improvement is in how these interactions have been gamified. Choosing a correct dialogue option when the choice is presented simply rewards currency. Enough to be engaging but not punishing enough to encourage reloading a save file and trying again. There is one major issue that these interactions all share, however, and it's their lack of voice acting.
I see.
Now look, I'm no knuckle-dragging troglodyte. I can read, but it goes without saying that an actual voice performance adds a lot to a scene. It feels like an impertinent criticism to say they should just do more, but they should just do more. It'd be one thing if it were just these optional scenes that lacked voice acting, but there are numerous main plot sequences that do as well. Its absence is made all the more noticeable given how great the voice performances are. What's more, it's enjoyable hearing all the different dialects of the British Isles the English localization went with.
My parents bowed and smiled for their money, and honestly, I despise them for it.
But why's fantasy always gotta be British? Look at another huge fantasy RPG that released recently, Baldur's Gate 3.
Hello. I'm Gale of Waterdeep.
Oi, fancy a bit of cheese, Gromit? If there's one thing Baldur's Gate shows, it's the importance of a good narrator, and it's one of the clear highlights of metaphor. Traveling is accompanied by a spine-tingling monologue by Moore, the game's Dr. Frankenstein's diminutive lab assistant equivalent. Dr. Frankenstein. Voiced by Greg Choon, who some might know as Mike from Super Smash Bros.
I fight for my friends. They warned their children of the dangers there. There are demons in those woods, they said. You mustn't go near.
It's a fantastic way to convey additional lore, and it perfectly sets the mood for wherever is being traveled to, like a deep, dark dungeon to fight some gobos. I have conflicted feelings about the combat portions. Difficulty-wise, I'd place them somewhere between the Karate Kid and Catherine. More difficult than the Karate Kid, but definitely less so than Catherine. I'm not fully convinced that fantasy is in fact dead, but I know for damn sure love is over. I feel Metaphor could have benefited from being more challenging for a very simple reason. The most challenging fights are the most engaging, requiring fine-tuning between all the game's systems and mechanics to overcome them. Switching out equipment, trying new skills, switching out party members, etc. Simpler fights just don't require this level of granularity. Not to be braggadocious, but especially in the latter half of the game, fights became an exercise in one-shotting, which is fun in its own right, but a bit anticlimactic when bosses don't even get a single turn. Would you shut the hell up? It's going to be very difficult to talk about this next part without sounding like a terrible racist, but if that's what it takes, then it's my cross to bear. In truth, I've never liked the Fire Emblem Heroes main theme. I fully acknowledge that it's for a stupid reason. I fully acknowledge that it is a well-made composition, the singer is clearly skilled, and it fits the epicness of bringing all the Fire Emblem characters together. But there's this weird moment when listening to it where you're like, wow, this track is awesome. Huh. I wonder what language it's in. Therein lies the true brilliance of having Metaphor's battle theme being a man spitting bars in Esperanto. Sure, it's thematically appropriate, being a sort of universal language, but moreover, it's a language not many people know. Taking a shot in the dark here, I guess this man is not speaking Esperanto well, if not just for the fact that it's an uncommon language. But that's the thing, I don't know. Whereas something like Fire Emblem Heroes, I know immediately that man is not speaking English well. Similar still, many of the tracks in Metaphor are fitting, but polarizing. Academia theme, deeply moving and powerful. And to avoid spoiling it, let's just say tracks like the Virga Island theme take a very specific type of person to want to listen to that. Although for a brand new IP that plays it pretty safe when it comes to its combat, I'm glad to see that at least some risk were taken with the music, even if they don't all pay off. Normal combat encounters are divided into two parts. A brief skirmish in the overworld that determines if the ensuing turn-based battle will begin with a player advantage or not. Though obviously the turn-based combat is the real meat of the experience, I found the light action combat to be a great addition. Although it's extremely simple, consisting only of a basic attack string and a dodge, it is fun messing around with the different movesets and seeing the different ways in which enemies attack. Surprisingly, it can get pretty intense, especially on hard difficulty where one wrong move will cause death.
Incoming!
Honestly, I didn't expect this to be the most exciting new feature of the game because looking at the turn-based combat tells a different story. This is the same battle system Atlas has been using for more than 30 years now, with the most minimal of changes. Metaphor ReFantazio's gameplay has no original bones in its body. It is the sole product of its predecessors, and it's the reason any discussion of this game will inextricably link it back to Final Fantasy III, because it is a game that does not stand on its own merits. If you ask me, the gameplay of Metaphor shows an unacceptable lack of innovation combined with a clear unwillingness to even try. I might not go as far as to call Atlas RPGs the Madden of RPGs, but there are worse metaphors. However, if we ignore all this and pretend that Metaphor is worthy of being its own standalone title, then hey, Metaphor ReFantazio is a fantastic video game. The press turn system is as fun as it's ever been. Attacking an enemy's weakness or landing a critical hit grants extra turns, while missing an attack or otherwise dealing no damage subtracts them. The same is true for enemies, and it makes for a dynamic combat system managing your own turns while trying to reduce enemy turns. The biggest difference The only difference with Metaphor is in the way abilities are gained. Party members can switch between different jobs outside of combat to confer differing elemental strengths and weaknesses, as well as differing abilities as they level up in that job. Skills can also be inherited, mixing and matching them to find the best party configurations. Not only that, but certain powerful skills can only be used with certain combinations of jobs, further encouraging experimentation. And if you thought this was a novel idea, well. Ostensibly, Metaphor's job system is a variant of Shin Megami Tensei's Demon Fusion, with all the same skills present, with all the same skills that have been present for over 30 years. The main difference is that instead of leaving it up to the player to freely explore and craft from a large pool of demons, Metaphor gives a smaller, more rigid pool of demons. Put this way, it's understandable that this more restrictive system sounds far inferior, but there are a few things of note. Number one with a bullet is that Shin Megami Tensei's Demon Fusion is arcane. It could just be that I'm a simpleton, but it feels little more than trial and error of seeing what makes what. There's merit to it, of course, but it's a system that could do with being more streamlined. Hence, Metaphor. Metaphor's system guarantees you'll see almost everything it has to offer. You may never see the skill Zeo if you never obtain a demon that has it, but in Metaphor, it's right there, clear as day, and always accessible. Oh, sorry, I mean conned. Oh, that's way different. If this is better or worse than Demon Fusion comes down to preference. With everything being available, Metaphor's iteration makes for a system that's more easily exploitable compared to the constant fluidity that is Demon Fusion. It is different, but it's the only difference. And when it's the same skills, the same strategies, interacting with the same combat system, well, how different is it really? Either way, I'm not convinced this job system holds up under scrutiny. As a result of it just being slapped over SMT systems, many of the jobs have a hard time standing out from one another. There's only so much variety SMT allows for, and it's stressed to its absolute thinnest to account for all the jobs. It works great for SMT where demons are constantly being switched out and fused together, but less so when everything is plainly laid out. Add to this the fact that any job can inherit any other job's skills, and the line really starts to blur. I will argue this until I die. Total freedom is not the way to go. It makes for less choices. Here's a metaphor. You go to the gun store. All kinds of guns. Big guns, small guns, handguns, shotguns. It all seems tempting. But there is no choice. I'm taking the Kalashnikov.
Cut that shit out!
There exists a game that is a perfect metaphor for Metaphor. A game that's everything Metaphor wishes it was. A game closely related to another massive franchise that bravely took on a name of its own. A game that took a real risk, and in doing so, created something remarkable. That game is, of course, Bravely Default. Spun off from Final Fantasy, Bravely Default is everything that's brilliant about a job system. Jobs have no problem standing out from each other. Each job has a unique skill when equipped with it that actually affects battle, not just overworld combat like in Metaphor. Each job can use the skills of any other job, but at a maximum of one at a time, choosing it as a sub-job. Passive skills can be inherited from any job, but there's a real cost and real decisions to be made. Characters have 5 skill slots with more powerful skills taking up more slots. If you want the Kalashnikov, you're gonna have to give up the fire axe. It is by no means a perfect game, In fact, there are numerous mistakes, missteps, and just flat-out terrible decisions no matter how you spin them. But that's the risk that comes with trying something new. Metaphor is just SMT. Bravely Default is not just Final Fantasy. Sure, it's extremely similar. White Mage, Black Mage, Cure, Fire, but Bravely Default deserves to be called Bravely Default because it does something unprecedented. Combat is structured around BP. Using the Brave command spends BP, allowing for multiple actions in a turn, while using the default command banks BP. The concept is explored thoroughly with passive and active skills interacting with BP. You can't look at any Final Fantasy game and say, wow, Bravely Default is simply derivative of that. It's not. It's unlike any Final Fantasy game, and it's unlike, well, anything. I don't know how many more times I have it in me to cast Rakunda 3 times, cast Terukaja 3 times, and then attack the enemy's weakness. I don't know. But again, any of this is a problem if we acknowledge Atlus's history. In a vacuum, Metaphor ReFantazio truly is a fantastic video game. And maybe this is the most unfair criticism of all time. Here would be my review if the SMT series never existed. Boys, those crazy bastards at Atlus have done it again. Following a 6-year hiatus after the release of Etrian Odyssey Nexus, the Sega Game Boy sees a new smash hit with the stellar Metaphor ReFantazio. How did they go from this first-person dungeon crawler to creating something entirely new with one of the most robust and interesting combat systems I've ever seen? Inspired? No. It's nothing short of divine. Mark my words. If they do nothing but make games with this combat system for the next 30 years, no one would even care. Couple that with a story that's captivating from beginning to end, and it's clear to see that Metaphor is the full package. Now, it's not without its flaws. Some of the dungeons are annoying to navigate, some of the dungeons have annoying gimmicks, and some of the annoying dungeons with annoying gimmicks are reused, which is annoying. Enemies are constantly reskinned and reused, one of the dungeons is clearly missing, and of course, the lack of full voice acting. However, I think these are relatively minor issues and they're understandable given the large scope of the game. Besides, they're issues that will assuredly be fixed when Atlus decides to release the complete version of Metaphor a few years from now. If Catherine the Catherine Full Body is any indication. Maybe call it Metaphor ReFantazio Royal Edition. You know, because of all the monarchy stuff. If all Atlus did was repackage and re-release their own games, there might be grounds to call them has-beens, but thankfully, there's not much precedent for that at this time. Well, anyways, my broskies, I'm gonna go fuck my wife. Laters. The way I interpret Metaphor is as a metaphor for itself. More specifically, for its developers. The idea of utopia, this perfect video game, is a fantasy. Too idealistic to be practical. But that's the point. It's that pursuit of greatness, that constant struggle that makes it all worth it. And yes, trying new things is scary. There's plenty of mistakes to be made and people will hate it. But how will we ever know what we can achieve if we never try? Well, anyway, I'm gonna go fuck my wife. No, all that to say, I feel like SMT Combat has reached a design plateau for a while now. It's a great system, but it has been for a long time. Minor tweaks or adjustments aren't going to change that, nor will they add anything of real significance. There are some improvements to the SMT Persona formula with Metaphor, but it also just is the formula. The fact that Metaphor can accurately be summed up as SMT and Persona is massively disappointing for a game not called either of those. If we suppose that the only thing that distinguishes Metaphor is its story, then it might as well be a visual novel. Not to wax poetic about the good old days, but when's the next Strange Journey or Devil Survivor? Games that take the tried and true formula but are unmistakably themselves. Or even SMT to Persona, shifting the focus to narrative elements and putting a bit of a twist on the combat. Looking to the future, if Metaphor is to be Atlus's new premier series, I fear it will just be more of the same of more of the same. I feel there's still so much to explore with SMT, but maybe that's just a foolhardy fantasy. A world in which we continue to innovate. I guess you could say that's my ReFantazio. My name's Tiz, short for autistic.